You think you know the Wild West, the lone gunslinger, the shootout at high noon, the sunset over Monument Valley. Good story, wrong story. Because here's what actually happened, and I'm not talking about a few uncomfortable details Hollywood left out. I'm talking about child laborers in gold mines, biological warfare, a prison so brutal that inmates begged to be shot, a government that built a railroad on the backs of 20,000 men, then passed a law to erase them. 28 truths. Every single one documented. Not one of them in your history textbook. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you're going to see the Wild West for exactly what it was. And it's nothing like what you were taught. Truth 1. In most Western towns, there were 2 burial grounds. One for the wealthy, stone headstones, names, fresh flowers. One for everyone else, a piece of wood driven into the dirt. No name, no date. One rainy season and it was gone. It's estimated that over 60% of people who died in the 19th century West lie in unmarked graves. Immigrant laborers, black cowboys, women from the brothels. They lived, they died. History erased them as if they had never existed. Truth 2. Hollywood loves showing you the sultry saloon girl or the strong ranch wife. Forget it. Most women of the West were exhausted. They washed the whole town's clothes with cracked, raw hands. They delivered each other's babies in rooms with no doctor. They buried their husbands, then their children, and the next morning went back out to the fields. An ordinary woman in Kansas in 1880 worked 16 hours a day, cooking, mending, tending livestock, raising children. No pay, no days off, because that was a wife's duty. That was their real life. Nobody makes a film about that. Truth 3. When the sheriff wasn't brutal enough, the corporations called the Pinkertons. Most people think the Pinkertons were a detective agency. Wrong. They were a private, armed force, hired by railroad and mining companies to do exactly one thing: crush strikes. With violence, they attacked workers, they beat people, they shot people dead. All completely legal, not law and order. Organized violence, dressed in suits and top hats. Truth 4. The gold rush of 1849. People retell it like a great adventure. Nobody talks about the 8-9-10-year-old children standing in stream beds all day with a gold pan, backs hunched over, hands numb from the cold. In the gold and silver mines, children were hired because of their small hands. They could crawl into shafts. Adults couldn't fit through. Paid less. No laws to protect them until the early 20th century. Many never came back up to the surface. Truth 5. Over 20,000 Chinese workers built the transcontinental railroad. They blasted through solid rock. They laid track across the desert. In 50-degree heat and -20 cold, paid 30% less than white workers. Had to buy their own food and tools. In 1869, the railroad was completed. A grand ceremony. Politicians, engineers, leaders, all lined up for the commemorative photograph. Not a single Chinese worker was invited. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. They expelled the very people who had built that country. Truth 6. Not every Western town lived long enough to become a legend. Hundreds of cities sprang up in just a few weeks whenever word spread of gold or silver. Thousands of people flooded in. Saloons went up before churches. Then the mine ran dry, often within 6 months. People left overnight, leaving entire towns behind furniture, clothes, sometimes half-eaten meals still on the table. Today, More than 500 ghost towns are scattered across the West. The skeletons of the American dream, abandoned in the desert. Truth 7. Mary Fields, 6 feet tall, nearly 200 pounds, smoked cigars, never hesitated to punch anyone. She was the first black woman and only the second woman in American history to be licensed as a federal mail carrier. At the age of 60, she drove her route through Montana blizzards, fought off thieves and robbers. 8 years without missing a single deadline. History remembers Jesse James. Mary Fields has nearly vanished entirely. Truth 8. To transport prisoners across the wilderness, Americans invented the prison wagon, a sealed, horse-drawn carriage, iron bars, no windows, inside, 15 to 20 people, no toilet, no water. Under the 104-degree heat of the Arizona desert or the bitter cold of the Wyoming plains, many died before they arrived, not from gunshots, from dehydration and suffocation, and not all of them were guilty. Some were simply undocumented immigrants, or native people arrested for trespassing on their own ancestors' land. Truth 9. Before the FDA existed, anyone could sell anything and call it medicine. Along the western trails, horse-drawn wagons belonging to traveling doctors rolled from town to town. They sold brown bottles cures for everything, according to the label. Inside, alcohol, morphine, cocaine, pine resin. People didn't get better, they just got addicted. When the wagon moved on, the entire town was dependent on that brown bottle. This was America's first opioid crisis happening in the 19th century, and nobody called it by that name. Truth 10. The 29th of November, 1864. Colonel John Chivington led 700 soldiers in an attack on a Cheyenne and Arapaho camp in Colorado. The camp was flying a white flag and an American flag, a sign they were under the protection of the federal government. Chivington didn't care. More than 230 people were massacred, most of them women, children, and the elderly. Soldiers posed for commemorative photographs with body parts of the victims. When they returned to Denver, they were welcomed as heroes. The press called it a great victory. It took over 150 years for the U.S. government to officially call it a massacre. Truth 11. Hollywood loves the scene of a cowboy tenderly stroking his horse, a loyal companion, one who understands his master's heart. The reality was completely different. Western horses were worked until they collapsed, then left behind or shot dead. On cattle drives, stretching thousands of miles, horses died from exhaustion, broken legs, disease. Cowboys took another and kept moving. Dead horses' bones were collected and processed into fertilizer, their hides made into new saddles. There was no room for sentiment when you were just trying to survive. Truth 12. Jesse James. People romanticize him as the Robin Hood of the West, but before he became an outlaw, what was Jesse James? An unemployed Civil War veteran, a farmer whose land was seized by the bank. He wasn't the exception. That was the story of hundreds of notorious Western outlaws, lost veterans, mine workers laid off when machines replaced human labor, farmers pushed to the margins by the system. The system created them. Then the system was surprised when they turned around and robbed it. Who made these outlaws? That's the real question. Truth 13. Yuma Territorial Prison, Arizona, opened in 1876. The press at the time described it as humane and modern. Inside, cells carved into solid rock cliffs. No light, no ventilation. Summer temperatures reaching 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Prisoners were given 1 bucket of water per day for drinking, bathing, and sanitation. Anyone who broke the rules was thrown into the dark hole, a pit dug into the ground, no light, no air, for days at a time. Many prisoners begged to be shot dead rather than stay there any longer. That was humane by 1876 Western standards. Truth 14. Native people had no immunity to European diseases. Smallpox, cholera, measles. Some tribes lost up to 90% of their population through contact alone. No war needed, just contact. But there are cases documented in the historical record. Wool blankets infected with smallpox were deliberately distributed to tribal nations. Not an accident, not negligence. People knew what they were doing, and they did it anyway. Truth 15. Before social media, there were dime novels, cheap, thin paperback books sold across the eastern seaboard from the 1860s through the 1890s. Those books were pure fiction. Buffalo Bill shooting down 500 bison in a single day. Wild Bill Hickok defeating 100 outlaws single-handedly. Buffalo Bill and Calamity Jane read stories written about themselves and didn't recognize the people in them. But millions of Easterners believed every word. And myth was built upon myth, layer upon layer, until no one could remember what the truth ever was. This didn't start in the 21st century. People have been deceived by fabricated content for far longer than that. Truth 16. Everyone knows about the cattle wars, conflicts between powerful ranch owners. Nobody knows about the sheep wars. From the 1870s through the early 20th century, cattle ranchers and sheep herders fought bloody battles across the West. Cattle ranchers believed sheep destroyed grazing land by cropping grass down to the roots. Their response: burning sheep flocks, shooting herders, poisoning water sources. In Arizona, New Mexico, and Wyoming, dozens of sheep herders were killed. Most of them were Basque and Mexican immigrants. Not a single prosecution. No films, no monuments, no names in the history books. Truth 17. Isaac Parker, judge at Fort Smith, Arkansas. People called him the hanging judge. Over 21 years, he sentenced 160 people to death. Many trials lasted under 30 minutes. No properly constituted jury, no meaningful appeal. He believed he was serving justice. But among those 160 people he hanged, how many were actually guilty? Nobody ever reviewed the cases. Nobody dared. Because in the West, a judge didn't interpret the law. He was the law. Truth 18. Every year, thousands of men left the East Coast and headed west in search of fortune. Most never wrote home. Not because they didn't want to. Most couldn't read or write. They were laborers from rural parts of Europe who had immigrated to America with hope, then vanished into this vast continent. Wives and children waited back east for years. No news. No money sent home. No explanation. Tens of thousands of families were torn apart, not from betrayal, from geography, from poverty, from a land that swallowed people whole and never gave them back. Truth 19. In the West, gold was what people searched for. Water was what people died over. Control of the water supply meant control over life itself. Large landowners hired armed guards to watch their wells. Small farmers dug wells on their own land and were sued or shot for stealing water that flowed through their property. In drought years, entire towns died of thirst, while a ranch owner 10 miles away was watering a herd of 5,000 cattle. The water wars of the West never ended. They just became law. Truth 20. Not all women in the West were brought there. Some chose to go there. to escape forced marriages, abusive families, the suffocating Eastern society, with all its rules about what a woman was supposed to be and do. The West was chaotic, but that very chaos created cracks in the system. Some women wore men's clothing, owned land, ran independent businesses, even divorced when Eastern law didn't allow it. Wyoming granted women the right to vote in 1869, not out of idealism, because they needed to attract women settlers and were willing to do whatever it took. Freedom sometimes comes from the least romantic reasons imaginable. Truth 21. Among those who built the American West were people from Asia, including Southeast Asians, recorded in immigration files under the vague category of Oriental laborers. They arrived on merchant ships, worked the docks of San Francisco, then drifted into the gold mines and railroad construction sites. Their names were Americanized into names no one could trace back. Their stories dissolved into the nameless crowd, but they were there. They built what people call the American dream, and history has never looked back to acknowledge it. Truth 22. People say the era of the Wild West ended in the 1890s. No. Land is still concentrated in the hands of the wealthy. Native people still live on reservations. Immigrant workers are still unprotected. Violence is still used to defend property, not people. Only the setting has changed. Horses became cars. Six-shooters became lawyers. Barbed wire became legal barriers. The game is the same. Only the costumes are different. Truth 23. After months of isolation on the trail, the cowboys' next stop after the saloon was the brothel. Syphilis and gonorrhea spread with no antibiotics to treat them. The most common treatment of the era? Mercury. It didn't cure anything. It just made patients die slower and in more pain from heavy metal poisoning. Let that sink in. The cure was almost as bad as the disease. Truth 24. To clear land for cattle ranches, the U.S. government actively encouraged the industrial-scale slaughter of bison. Over 50 million bison were killed, not for meat, not for hides. To cut off the lifeline of native tribes, people who depended on the bison for everything: food, shelter, clothing, survival. No bison, no life. The tribes starved and lost their ancestral lands. That wasn't a side effect, that was the point. Truth 25. Legally free. Practically, not even close. Black cowboys like Nat Love were paid less and handed the most dangerous jobs on the drive, breaking the wildest, most unbroken horses, crossing the most treacherous river crossings, doing the work nobody else would touch, free on paper, unequal in every other way that mattered. Truth 26. The classic quick-draw duel, faster draw wins, loser dies in the street almost never happened. Real violence in the West wasn't cinematic, it was bureaucratic. Organized campaigns to push native people onto barren reservations. Land grabs that stripped away millions of acres and handed them to powerful ranching interests. No dramatic shootout, just decades of slow, systematic dispossession, one policy at a time. That's what violence looks like when it has lawyers. Truth 27. Months alone in a remote cabin in the middle of nowhere, no one to talk to, nothing but silence and open land. A lot of men broke, deep depression, paranoia, talking to objects just to hear a voice. Today we'd call it PTSD. Back then it had no name, no treatment, and nobody asking if you were okay. The only prescription available was whiskey, and a lot of men simply disappeared into the desert or into their own heads, never to come back from either. Truth 28. Here's the irony nobody wants to admit. Towns like Dodge City and Tombstone had gun control laws stricter than many U.S. states today. The moment you crossed the town line, you were required to hand over your sidearm at the sheriff's office. No exceptions. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral in 1881, it happened because the Clanton gang refused to comply with that ordinance. Not over a grudge, not over a woman, over a weapons check-in policy. Let that land for a second. So that's the real Wild West. No heroes riding off into the sunset, no romantic frontier spirit, just ordinary people. Black cowboys paid less for deadlier work, Chinese laborers who built a nation and weren't even invited to the ceremony, women who worked 6-hour days with no name in the history books, children who went into mines and never came back up. They built this country, and this country forgot them on purpose. Here's the thing, none of this is ancient history. The land is still concentrated in the same hands. The workers are still unprotected. The names are still being erased. The West didn't end, it just stopped wearing a hat. If you made it this far, you now know what most people refuse to look at. Share this video, because the only way buried stories survive is if someone refuses to let them stay buried.